The Gulfstream jet, worth $80 million, had been repaired overnight after every certified maintenance center in the region had failed to touch it. Mechanics from 3 different facilities had walked away shaking their heads, unwilling to put their names on a problem they could not solve. Only one man had said yes, and by dawn the impossible had been done. Yet when morning came, the woman who owned the aircraft looked at the invoice on her desk and said, without lifting her eyes, that he would not receive a single dollar because the final approval signature was missing. The man across from her did not argue. He simply reached up, unclipped the engineer's badge from his collar, set it quietly on the table, and walked out of the hangar without another word, leaving behind an aircraft that was mechanically perfect and, in every legal sense that mattered, entirely unaccountable. An hour later, something happened that no one in that company had ever seen before, something that would ripple far beyond a single runway before the week was over. Every pilot scheduled to fly that jet refused, one after another, to take it into the air. Because a man named Ethan Brooks had just been told his word meant nothing, and in the world he came from, that was a debt no amount of money could repay. Victoria Sinclair had built an empire from nothing, and by the age of 39 she ran a technology company valued in the tens of billions. With her name printed on magazine covers from New York to Singapore, she was brilliant, decisive, and utterly convinced that money was the answer to every problem life presented her, a philosophy that had served her well from her earliest days, pitching investors in cramped conference rooms to the boardrooms she now commanded with a single glance. Colleagues described her as fearless, though those closer to her sometimes used a different word behind closed doors, one that suggested her fearlessness had less to do with courage and more to do with never having faced a consequence she could not eventually outspend. To Victoria, contractors were interchangeable, replaceable, and ultimately, beneath her attention, once their invoices were paid. Or in some cases, not paid at all, a habit she had never once had reason to question, because no one had ever pushed back hard enough to make her. She had built her fortune on the belief that leverage always belonged to whoever held the checkbook, and nothing in her experience had ever proven her wrong, not in acquisitions, not in negotiations, and certainly not in the small daily transactions that made up the operation of her private life. That belief was about to be tested in a way she never anticipated. On a runway, outside a private airfield, over a jet she needed more than she had ever needed anything, and over a man whose name she would not soon forget. She was scheduled to fly to an international summit that would determine billions of dollars in future contracts, and her Gulfstream G700 was the only aircraft that could get her there on time, a summit her competitors would gladly attend in her absence if given the chance. 2 days before departure, the jet's flight control electrical system threw an error that no diagnostic tool could immediately explain, and the aircraft was grounded, declared AOG, aircraft on ground, a term every executive in private aviation dreads, since it meant a schedule built around certainty had suddenly collapsed into an open question with no clear answer. 3 maintenance centers were called in sequence, each sending their best technicians, and each leaving after several hours with nothing but apologies and a growing list of parts they suspected needed replacing, none of them willing to guarantee that even those replacements would solve a problem they could not fully identify. Marcus Hale, her director of aviation, stood in her office with a face that told her the news before he spoke a word, having spent the entire morning fielding phone calls from technicians who each offered a different theory, and none offered a solution. There was only one name left on his list, a name he almost hesitated to say aloud. Aware of how Victoria typically reacted to solutions that did not come from established, easily controlled channels, he told her there was a freelance engineer, a man the Federal Aviation Administration itself sometimes called when its own investigators ran out of answers, and that if anyone could solve this before the summit, it would be him. Victoria's first reaction was dismissive, almost amused, as she asked whether he meant some independent contractor working out of a garage somewhere. Marcus told her, calmly, that this particular man had spent years as an aircraft maintenance engineer for the United States Air Force before going independent, and that pilots up and down the coast spoke his name, the way soldiers speak of a commanding officer they trust with their lives. His name was Ethan Brooks, 42 years old, a single father whose children had long since grown and moved on with their own lives, a man who lived simply despite being quietly famous within the tight circle of aviation professionals who mattered. Marcus added, almost as an afterthought, that Ethan had left a lucrative position at a major maintenance firm years earlier, walking away from a six-figure salary because the company had pressured him to sign off on repairs he considered unsafe. Since then, he had worked entirely on his own terms, choosing only the jobs that interested him and turning away far more work than he accepted, regardless of how much money was offered. Victoria found that detail almost impossible to reconcile with anything in her own experience. Having never once met a man who valued principle over profit when the two came into direct conflict, Victoria, out of options and running out of time, agreed to bring him in, though she made it clear she expected results, not excuses. When Ethan arrived at the hangar that afternoon, he did not rush toward the aircraft the way the previous technicians had. He walked around it slowly, almost like a man greeting an old and complicated friend, running his hand along the fuselage before he ever opened an access panel. He wore no uniform, carried no branded toolbox, and offered no introduction beyond his name and a firm handshake. Yet, something about his presence immediately shifted the mood inside the hangar. The three previous teams had filled the space with noise, with raised voices and hurried phone calls to their own supervisors, seeking guidance. Ethan filled it instead with a kind of stillness that made even the most impatient people in the room instinctively lower their voices. He said very little to anyone in the room, and what he did say was direct and unembellished. He asked for the complete logbook, the full maintenance history going back to the day the aircraft left the factory, and unrestricted access to inspect every system without interruption. Victoria found the request irritating, unused to being told what she would provide rather than simply providing what she chose, but she agreed, if only because no one else had offered even that much confidence. Ethan spent the first hour simply reading, flipping through years of maintenance records, with the patience of a man who understood that answers were often buried in details other people considered irrelevant. By the time he closed the final folder, he had already narrowed the problem down to a specific era of the aircraft's service history, long before he ever touched a wire. What he found, though he did not yet say it aloud, was something none of the previous three teams had even considered looking for. Ethan worked through the entire night without sleeping, moving methodically from one circuit to the next, tracing the aircraft's electrical nervous system wire by wire under the harsh light of the hangar. He did not order a single expensive replacement part, and he did not chase the obvious, high-cost theories that the other technicians had proposed. Instead, he found something almost invisible, a single signal wire that had been connected incorrectly during a maintenance visit years earlier, a mistake so small it had gone unnoticed through dozens of subsequent inspections. The discrepancy was measured in fractions that most engineers would never think to question. Yet, under the exact combination of conditions present during flight, it was capable of causing the control system to misread its own signals mid-air. It was the kind of error that could sit dormant for years and then surface at the worst possible moment, 30,000 feet above the ocean, with no room for a second attempt. He corrected the connection with the same quiet focus he had shown from the moment he walked in, then tested every related system twice before running a full simulated flight sequence to confirm the fix held under pressure. Around 3 in the morning, one of the junior technicians assigned to assist him asked why he bothered testing the same circuit a second and then a third time when the readings had already come back clean on the first attempt. Ethan answered without looking up from his work, saying only that an aircraft does not care how confident a man feels, and that confidence had killed more pilots than mechanical failure ever had. The young technician said nothing further after that, watching in silence as Ethan repeated the same sequence a fourth time before he was finally satisfied. By sunrise, the aircraft was cleared, its systems behaving exactly as they should, its history of failure resolved by a single overlooked wire that 3 teams of professionals had missed entirely. Daniel Ross, the company's chief pilot with more than 18,000 flight hours behind him, arrived to review the work personally before agreeing to fly the jet again. Daniel had a reputation across the industry. He spent nearly an hour going through Ethan's documentation, cross-referencing every page against the physical systems himself, rather than simply trusting the written word, a habit that had kept him alive through 3 decades of flying. After going through Ethan's documentation line by line, Daniel looked up and told the room, without exaggeration, that it was one of the finest diagnostic efforts he had witnessed in his entire career. He shook Ethan's hand, an unusual gesture for a man who rarely extended that courtesy to contractors he had only just met, and told him plainly that he would trust his own family aboard this aircraft without a second thought. Word of what Ethan had done moved quickly through the small, tightly connected world of private aviation, and by midday, mechanics and pilots who had never met him were already speaking his name with a new kind of respect. The following morning, Ethan arrived to submit his final report and invoice, expecting the straightforward conclusion of a job well documented and thoroughly completed. He had barely slept, having gone home only long enough to shower before returning to finish the paperwork properly, treating the administrative closing of the job with the same care he had given the repair itself. Victoria read through the paperwork at her desk, her expression unreadable, before finally looking up with something close to a smile that carried no warmth in it at all. She told him the final approval signature was missing from the internal authorization chain, and that without it, she would not be releasing payment for his work, delivering the line with the same flat efficiency she might have used to reject an underperforming vendor contract. Marcus, standing nearby, visibly flinched at the words, understanding immediately how this would be received by a man who had just spent an entire night saving her aircraft, and he opened his mouth to intervene before deciding, out of habit, that it was not his place to contradict her in front of an outside contractor. Daniel, who happened to be in the room reviewing flight logs, looked up in open disbelief, unable to reconcile what he was hearing with the woman who had thanked him warmly only hours earlier for confirming the jet was airworthy. He glanced toward Ethan, half expecting him to demand an explanation or raise his voice the way most people would after being treated so dismissively following such an effort. Ethan did not raise his voice, and he did not argue the point, though everyone in the room seemed to expect him to. He simply asked her, in a calm and even tone, whether this was truly her final decision, giving her one clear opportunity to reconsider before anything else happened. Victoria answered without hesitation that it was, her voice carrying the practiced certainty of someone who had never had to answer for a decision like this before. Ethan nodded once, then reached for the same report she had just refused to pay for, and signed it again, this time formally withdrawing his technical certification of the repair he had completed. In the world of aviation maintenance, that signature was not a formality, but the entire foundation of legal accountability, the single piece of paper that told every future pilot the aircraft was safe to fly. Without his name behind the work, the repair effectively did not exist in the eyes of anyone who understood what that signature meant. He stood, gathered nothing but his own coat, and told her quietly that he hoped she would never need him a second time, before walking out through the same hangar doors he had entered the night before. Later that day, Daniel prepared for the scheduled departure, running through his usual pre-flight review of the aircraft's documentation before stepping aboard, humming quietly to himself the way he always did before a flight, a small ritual that had accompanied him through thousands of takeoffs over the years. He asked, almost as a formality, who had provided the final technical sign-off on the previous night's repair, expecting to hear Ethan's name confirmed in the paperwork the way it had been every time before. Marcus, uncomfortable, explained that Ethan had withdrawn his certification that morning after a disagreement over payment, leaving the repair technically unconfirmed by the one person who had actually diagnosed and fixed the problem. Daniel said nothing for a long moment, simply closing the folder in his hands and setting it down on the counter in front of him, his humming stopping mid-note as the weight of what he had just heard settled over him. Then, in a voice that left no room for negotiation, a voice honed by decades of making decisions that could not be undone once the wheels left the ground, he told them plainly that he would not be flying the aircraft under those conditions. He added, almost gently, that this was not personal and had nothing to do with doubting the quality of the repair itself, but that a signature was not simply a formality to him, it was the entire chain of trust that made flight possible in the first place. Victoria, informed within minutes, reacted with fury, immediately ordering Marcus to bring in a replacement pilot from the company's approved list, certain that Daniel's stance was little more than an inconvenient overreaction she could easily route around. The second pilot, once briefed on the exact same circumstances, declined just as firmly as Daniel had, citing the same concern over the missing certification. A third candidate gave the identical answer within the hour, and by the time a fourth pilot turned down the assignment, Marcus could no longer pretend this was a coincidence. One of them, a younger captain with only a few years of experience flying private jets, admitted over the phone that he had never even met Ethan Brooks in person, but that every senior pilot he respected had told him the same thing early in his career, that a grounded aircraft was always safer than an unsigned one. Each of them offered nearly the same explanation, almost word for word, that if Ethan Brooks had withdrawn his technical accountability from a repair, they had no intention of placing their own license and their passengers' lives behind his absence. Marcus even attempted to reach outside the company's usual network, contacting charter services and independent pilots who owed the company favors from previous arrangements, hoping distance from the original dispute might change the calculation. It did not. Word had already traveled faster than he could make phone calls, moving through group chats and private messages among a community of professionals who trusted each other's judgment more than they trusted any paycheck. Victoria stood in her office, staring at a phone that had stopped ringing with good news, beginning, for the first time in years, to feel something unfamiliar creeping into her certainty. The jet that had cost her tens of millions of dollars and represented everything her company had built was now sitting motionless on the tarmac because of a decision she had made over a single missing signature. For the first time, she started to wonder whether the man she had dismissed so easily held more power in this world than she did. Unsettled and increasingly desperate, Victoria asked her assistants to quietly gather everything they could find about Ethan Brooks, expecting to uncover very little beyond a small independent contractor with an inflated sense of self-importance. What she found instead unsettled her far more than the grounded aircraft ever had. Ethan had spent years preventing accidents before they happened, called in by federal investigators and private operators alike whenever a problem defied easy explanation. He had personally trained a generation of aircraft engineers who now held senior positions across the industry, many of whom still credited him directly for the standards they upheld in their own work. Several of the very pilots who had refused to fly her jet that day had once worked alongside him early in their careers, learning under his direct supervision before earning their own wings. One retired captain, reached briefly by phone, told her assistant something that would later be repeated to Victoria word for word, that when Ethan Brooks said an aircraft was safe, they flew without a second thought. And when Ethan Brooks stayed silent, they stayed on the ground, no matter what anyone else claimed. The weight of that statement settled over Victoria slowly, the way truth often does when it arrives too late to be convenient. She had spent her entire career believing that reputation could be purchased, replaced, or simply overridden by sufficient capital. And here was a man whose reputation apparently could not be bought at any price she was willing to pay. She learned, too, that Ethan had once been called in after a near-catastrophic incident involving a regional airline, arriving at 3 a.m. to trace a fault that 2 federal investigators had spent an entire week failing to locate. He had found the answer within 6 hours, working alone, and had never once mentioned the incident publicly or used it to build his own reputation, letting the story spread instead through the quiet respect of the people who had witnessed it firsthand. It was a strange and uncomfortable realization for a woman who measured almost everything in the world by what it cost and what it was worth in return. She began to understand, faintly and reluctantly, that there existed an entire economy of trust running beneath the one she had spent her life mastering, and that she had just discovered its existence by breaking one of its unwritten rules. In her world, a broken agreement could usually be repaired with an apology, a settlement, or simply enough time for the offense to be forgotten among people with short memories and shorter attention spans. In Ethan's world, apparently, a broken agreement meant something closer to a broken bond, the kind that could not be repaired with money, because money had never been the currency in question to begin with. She thought about the years she had spent building relationships with investors and partners, entirely through the language of contracts and incentives, and wondered, for the first time, whether that language had ever actually earned her the loyalty she assumed it had bought. The jet sitting idle in the hangar was no longer simply a mechanical problem waiting for a signature. It had become a mirror, reflecting something about her own judgment that she was not yet ready to fully confront. A reflection she found she could not look away from no matter how many times she tried to return to the familiar comfort of her spreadsheets and quarterly projections. Meanwhile, the aircraft itself remained exactly where it had been left, silent and unmoving on the private runway, a machine worth tens of millions of dollars accomplishing absolutely nothing for its owner. Every hour it sat, idle translated into hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost opportunity, delayed negotiations, and mounting frustration among international partners who had structured their own schedules around Victoria's arrival. Her own board members began calling, first with polite concern, and then with barely concealed irritation, wanting to know why a woman famous for solving impossible problems could not solve the simple matter of finding a pilot. She gave vague answers, unwilling to admit the true cause of the delay, aware that the full story would not reflect well on her judgment if it ever became widely known. The summit she was meant to attend was drawing closer with each passing hour, and word had begun quietly circulating among industry insiders that something unusual was happening with her company's flight operations. A handful of journalists who covered corporate aviation had started asking pointed questions, sensing a story forming beneath the surface of a delay that no one inside the company would fully explain. One reporter, working a routine story on private aviation trends, noticed an unusual pattern of pilot cancellations tied to the same tail number and began making calls of his own, though he had not yet connected the dots to Ethan Brooks directly. Victoria continued attempting to secure a replacement pilot through every channel available to her, offering incentives far beyond standard compensation to anyone willing to take the assignment. Not a single qualified pilot accepted. And every conversation ended the same way, with a polite but immovable refusal to trade professional integrity for a paycheck. However generous it might be, Marcus, increasingly caught between his employer's mounting pressure and his own growing understanding of what had actually happened, made the decision to visit Ethan's workshop personally, hoping to find some way to repair what had been broken beyond the aircraft itself. He found Ethan exactly where he expected, working quietly on another project, unbothered by the storm his departure had created across an entire company. The workshop was modest, tucked behind a small hangar on the edge of the airfield, filled with neatly organized tools and framed photographs of aircraft he had worked on over the years, rather than any trophies or awards. Marcus asked, carefully, whether there was anything that could be done to bring him back, whether an apology or a different arrangement might change his position. Ethan listened patiently, then explained, without anger or bitterness, that this had never truly been about the money owed to him for a single repair. His concern ran deeper than any invoice, rooted in something he had spent his entire career trying to protect. He told Marcus a brief story from years earlier, about a young technician he had once mentored who had been pressured by a different employer into signing off on a repair before it was properly verified, and how that same aircraft had experienced a serious malfunction months later that very nearly cost several lives. That memory, he said, was the reason he could never simply let a broken principle slide by unspoken, regardless of how small the disagreement might look from the outside. If a chief executive was willing to withhold payment from an engineer after he had already solved a life-threatening problem, he explained, that same executive would eventually be willing to pressure engineers into signing off on work that was not actually safe, simply because it was convenient or profitable to do so. That, Ethan said quietly, was the real danger hiding behind what looked like a simple financial disagreement. He told Marcus, in words that would later be repeated throughout the company more than once, that safety in aviation begins with honesty, and that once honesty becomes negotiable, no signature and no certification means anything at all. He reminded Marcus that every checklist, every inspection form, and every signed authorization in the industry existed for one reason only, to ensure that the person putting their name on a piece of paper was staking their own integrity on the truth of what it said. The moment that integrity could be pressured or bypassed for convenience, he explained, the entire structure of trust holding the industry together began to erode, one small compromise at a time, until eventually something broke that could not be repaired with an apology. Marcus left the workshop with more to think about than he had arrived with, understanding for the first time that this had never been a dispute over money, but a test of principle that Victoria had failed without even realizing a test was taking place. He returned to the company uncertain how to explain this distinction to a woman who measured every conflict in terms of leverage and cost, rehearsing several different ways to phrase it during the short drive back, none of which felt adequate to the weight of what he now understood. What he did know, with growing certainty, was that Ethan Brooks was not going to change his position through persuasion, incentive, or pressure of any kind. The only path forward, if there was one, would have to come from Victoria herself, and from whatever she was willing to admit about the choice she had made. Back at her office, Victoria finally sat down to review the security footage from the night of the repair. Footage she had never bothered to watch until the entire situation had spiraled far beyond her control. She watched hour after hour of Ethan working alone in the hangar, moving methodically through systems most people would never understand, pausing only to drink water from a bottle he had brought himself. He did not stop to eat. He did not leave the aircraft for more than a few minutes at any point during the entire night. Driven by something that clearly went beyond simple professional obligation, she read through his written report a second time, more carefully now, noticing details she had skimmed past the first time in her hurry to find fault with the paperwork. She spoke quietly with members of her own maintenance staff, several of whom admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that they believed she had made a serious mistake in how she had handled the situation. One veteran technician, who had worked for the company for over a decade and rarely offered his opinion unprompted, told her plainly that in all his years in the industry, he had never once seen a client withhold payment from an engineer who had just delivered a flawless diagnosis under pressure. He added that word of the incident had already reached technicians at 2 other companies he knew personally, and that the story was not being told in her favor. No one in the company said this to her face directly, out of deference to her position, but the silence in the room, whenever the subject came up, told her everything she needed to know. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Victoria felt something close to shame settle over her, an emotion she had spent years training herself not to show and rarely allowed herself to feel. She had built her entire identity around the idea that decisiveness was strength, that hesitation was weakness, and that anyone who worked for her ultimately worked for the money she provided them. She thought back to the early years of her company, remembering a time before the billions, when she herself had once been the one waiting on a payment that never arrived on time, and how that memory had somehow faded into irrelevance the moment she had power enough to be on the other side of the transaction. Watching Ethan on that footage, working through the night for reasons that clearly had nothing to do with financial incentive, forced her to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps there were people in the world who could not be motivated, controlled, or measured by the same rules she had used to build her fortune. Perhaps her success had made her blind to a kind of value that had nothing to do with numbers on a balance sheet, a value some people carried inside themselves, regardless of what the world offered or withheld from them in return. She sat alone in her office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at a paused frame of a tired man, checking one more wire before finally allowing himself to rest. And for the first time in a long while, she did not reach for her phone to fix the problem the way she usually did. The next morning, Victoria did something she had not done in years, arriving at Ethan's workshop without an assistant, without legal counsel, and without the security detail that normally accompanied her everywhere she went. She had dressed simply that day, without the usual tailored armor she wore into boardrooms, as though some part of her understood that none of that would matter here. She carried with her an envelope containing the full payment for the repair, along with an additional bonus far beyond what the original invoice had specified. Believing, out of old habit, that a larger number might still be the fastest way to smooth over what had happened, Ethan accepted the envelope politely, opened it in front of her, then quietly removed the bonus portion and placed it back on the counter between them. He kept only the exact amount originally owed for the work he had performed, nothing more and nothing less than what had been fairly earned. The gesture unsettled her more than any argument could have, because it removed the one tool she had always relied upon to resolve conflict, leaving her standing in a small workshop with nothing left to offer but her own honesty. Victoria asked him, genuinely confused, why he would refuse money that was rightfully his to take if he wanted it. A question that seemed to surprise even her as it left her mouth. He answered simply that he had not repaired her aircraft in hopes of receiving a reward beyond his agreed fee, but because somewhere, eventually, real people would be sitting in those seats when the jet left the ground. He added, after a pause, that the moment he started doing the work for anything other than that reason, he would no longer trust his own judgment the next time a life depended on it, and that was a risk he was not willing to take, no matter what it cost him personally. Victoria stood quietly for a long moment, turning the envelope over in her hands, searching for a response that did not sound as hollow as everything she might have said only a week earlier. She realized, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, that she was in the presence of someone operating by an entirely different set of rules. Rules that had nothing to do with negotiation, leverage, or the comfortable assumption that everyone eventually had a price. Something in that answer broke through whatever composure Victoria had carried into the room, and for the first time in front of another person in longer than she could recall, she felt tears rise that she could not immediately stop. She had spent her career treating every transaction as a negotiation to be won, and here stood a man who had turned down free money simply because accepting it would have contradicted the reason he did his work in the first place. She thought, briefly and painfully, of every contractor and vendor she had ever pushed to accept less than they were owed, simply because she could, and how easily she had always justified it as sound business practice rather than what it actually was. She realized, standing in that small and unremarkable workshop, that she had misjudged him completely from the very first conversation, seeing only a contractor where an entire philosophy of integrity had been standing in front of her the whole time. Quietly, without performance or excessive apology, she told him she was sorry, not only for the missing payment, but for the assumption she had carried into every interaction with him, the assumption that his cooperation could simply be bought or withheld at her convenience. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she meant those words without calculating what they might cost her afterward, without an angle, without a follow-up strategy waiting behind them. Ethan accepted the apology with the same calm he had shown throughout the entire ordeal, neither gloating nor dismissing what it had taken for her to say it. He told her, gently, that most people never got the chance to see themselves clearly the way this situation had forced her to, and that what mattered now was not the apology itself, but whether anything about her actually changed afterward. It was, in its own understated way, the most honest conversation either of them had had in a very long time. Word of the apology reached Daniel Ross within hours, and shortly afterward he returned to review the aircraft's documentation one final time before agreeing to resume his duties. Ethan, satisfied that the situation had been properly resolved, signed the technical certification a second time, formally restoring his accountability to the repair he had completed days earlier. Daniel read the newly signed page carefully, then looked at Marcus, and remarked quietly that it took a certain kind of courage for someone in Victoria's position to admit fault so plainly, especially to a man she had once dismissed without a second thought. With his signature back in place, every pilot who had previously refused the assignment agreed without hesitation to return to full flight status, their objection having never truly been about the aircraft's mechanical condition at all, but about something far more fundamental that had finally been set right. The Gulfstream, finally cleared in every sense that mattered, lifted off the runway later that afternoon, exactly as it had been designed and repaired to do, carrying Victoria toward the summit she had originally intended to reach days earlier. Victoria stood near the terminal window watching it climb into the sky before boarding, understanding now something she would carry with her for the rest of her career. There were people in the world whose trust and integrity simply could not be purchased, no matter how large the number written on the check in front of them, and pretending otherwise had nearly cost her far more than a delayed flight. As the aircraft leveled off above the clouds, she found herself thinking not about the summit ahead of her, but about the quiet workshop she had stood in only a day earlier, and the man who had taught her more about honesty in a single conversation than a decade of boardroom meetings ever had. In the months that followed, Victoria quietly restructured her entire company's approach to technical contracts and vendor relationships, ensuring that engineers and independent specialists were never again placed in a position where their professional judgment could be overridden by a missing signature or a delayed approval. She personally reviewed the new policy with her legal team, line by line, insisting on language that protected contractors even in situations where internal approval chains broke down through no fault of their own. Every technician who worked on her aircraft going forward was guaranteed fair and prompt payment, protected by clear contractual language that left no room for the kind of dispute that had nearly cost her everything, and Marcus was given the authority to approve emergency payments on the spot whenever a similar situation arose in the future. Ethan never accepted any formal position within her company, despite more than one offer extended to him in the following year, choosing instead to remain exactly where he had always been, working quietly in his own small shop on his own terms. Victoria understood, better than she once would have, that this was not stubbornness but consistency, the same quality that had made his word worth more than any contract in the first place. He continued training the next generation of aircraft engineers much as he always had, passing along the same uncompromising standards that had earned him his reputation in the first place, occasionally mentioning the incident with Victoria's aircraft to his students, not as a story of triumph, but as a simple example of what happens when principle is treated as negotiable, and then, eventually, is not. Daniel Ross flew for Victoria's company for several more years, and it became something of a quiet tradition between them that whenever a new aircraft entered the fleet, he would personally recommend Ethan for its initial inspection, regardless of cost or convenience. Marcus, for his part, rose within the company, in part because he had proven, during the worst of the crisis, that he was willing to tell his employer an uncomfortable truth, rather than simply agree with whatever she wanted to hear. Within the aviation community, a phrase began circulating that summer, repeated among pilots, engineers, and executives alike. Whenever the subject of that particular company came up in conversation, a person could own the most expensive aircraft in the world, the saying went, but it would only truly leave the ground once the people responsible for keeping it safe were treated with the respect their work had always deserved. It was a lesson Victoria never forgot, one she quietly carried into every boardroom and every negotiation for the rest of her career, long after the details of that single grounded flight had faded from public memory. And somewhere on a quiet airfield, in a small workshop filled with the smell of oil and the steady hum of an old radio, a single father kept working the same way he always had. One aircraft at a time, one honest signature at a time, asking for nothing more than what was fair, and refusing always to accept anything less.